you for that reading, it was lovely. Just a couple of pieces of trivia as we begin. Did you realise that the name Orpah, Oprah Winfrey was going to be called Orpah? Did you know that? And her father made a spelling mistake, and that's why she's called Oprah. Yeah, that's a good. And the other bit of trivia was, I think it's always encouraging when you get newer music, and they've pinched it from the old music, you know. I've decided to follow Jesus. And it was quite hard to sing because I remember when the Fisher folk sang it in the 1980s, and I was singing it the Fisher folk version and sort of that. So a couple of pieces of trivia for you. So if you've got a Bible, perhaps you turn with me to Ruth chapter 1. The New International Version, it's page 267. And if you've got a bit of paper, maybe tear it off and stick it in there for the next time, because we're going to be in Ruth for a few weeks anyway. And in the New Living Translation, it's page 208. So that's the Pew Bibles. But as we begin, we're going to watch a video clip. Thank you, John.
This is...
You Got a Friend in Me?
Yep, by Claire and Dad.
You got a friend in me. You got a friend in me. Yeah, you got a friend in me.
Isn't that great? Isn't it?
Singing.
Just a beautiful clip. And I think the song says it already. It talks about friendship. It's talking about devotion to someone. It's talking about being willing to sacrifice for someone. And it suggests something that's more than just pals, isn't it? And there's the qualities of thought, of giving, of consideration, of an openness of hand, being willing to do anything for someone. And all of that we'll be seeing over the next few weeks. And I promise it won't go on for 20 odd weeks, in the book of Ruth. But the one thing I wanted us to look at today is integrity. Integrity is a very interesting word that brings with it a meaning of honour, of truth, of righteousness, and even peace. And integrity is a quality that we quite rightly desire, particularly during our recent election time. There was one of those things, people wanted to see integrity. And it's something that so easily slips through our fingers when we're tempted to pass judgment, when we're tempted to lie or determine that our way is the only way. And I've sadly had too many encounters in churches where folks said it's my way or no way. And for them it was often the highway. Sadly, integrity is a quality that if it's lost, It can devastate a life, it can devastate a community, it can even devastate a nation. And too often we find ourselves praying, for example, for our politicians, and that's been high on the agenda. And thank you for mentioning that, Sam. I saw that this morning as well. And it's the integrity not just of having the freedom to speak publicly and to be defended from assassination attempts, etc., but it's also the integrity to deal with things humbly. And certainly that was a difficult one today. I mean, I'm sure I may have told you this story before of a busload of politicians who were on a day trip together, and they're all in the country, gone on a bit of a mystery tour, when there was a blowout on the tyre and it skidded and it went right off the road and it hit a tree. And the farmer was working in his field, and he found out who they were, and because he's on the side of the bus, politicians on tour and all the rest of it. So he went and got his JCB and he dug a big hole and he buried the bus. And a little while later, the police were taking witness statements and everything, and they found out why this bus had gone missing with all these politicians. And someone said, "We saw the farmer burying a bus." So they went to his house and he came out and they said to him, we've been hearing stories that you buried a bus in the field. He said, "Yeah, it was full of politicians." He said, "But they're all dead." He said, "How do you know they're all dead? There was no doctor at the scene." He said, "Well, some said they were alive, but you know how these politicians lie." No. See, all too often, integrity is a quality that is reached for, but it's something that disappears like a vapour. Although, I've got to say, I was very impressed at how our current Prime Minister and the now Leader of the Opposition actually behaved in the House when they first got back after the election. And it promoted this better feel for politics. I don't know if you felt that as well. And actually, it was all over the news, and despite all the efforts of the journalists to destroy it, they couldn't take away from that feel-good factor that actually we're now going to start working together. Now, the book of Ruth is one of integrity. Primarily, it's a story that demonstrates the integrity of God. And it reflects on how he moves in ways that are beyond our ken. Sorry, that's a Scottish phrase. It's a story for people who wonder where God is when the heavens feel like brass and there's no answers and there's an absence of dreams and visions and prophecy. It's a book for those who wonder where God is when one tragedy after another attacks their faith. And it's a story for people who wonder whether a life of integrity in tough times is really worth living at all, as the standards of society seem to slip and slide all over the place. And it's a story for people who can't imagine that anything great could ever come of their ordinary life of faith. Now, according to chapter 1 and verse 1, if you look, the story of Ruth takes place during the time of the Judges. Now, this period was just a 400-year period after Israel had entered the Promised Land under the leadership of Joshua, and before there were any kings in Israel. And this was dated on the calendar between 1500 and 1100 BCE. Now, the book of Judges comes just before Ruth in our Bible, and we can see from the very last verse of Judges what kind of place it was. And if you look at the screen, I'll put it up there for you, save you looking it up. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did as he saw fit. Historically, this was a really, really dark time in Israel. Anarchy was reigning, and society was filled with folk who looked just out for themselves and not for their neighbour. Sounds a bit to me like modern days when the famous politician who said there's no such thing as society, just a collection of individuals. And if we were to examine that philosophy a bit further, we can see how successive governments in recent years in our country have gone to great lengths to deconstruct any meaningful unity and cooperation. And they replaced these things with good ideas that never worked, did they? Now, here in the time of Ruth, there was this vicious cycle because people had no regard for anyone else. The people would fall into sin. God would allow enemies to come against them. The people would cry to God for help. And then God would provide for them a judge or a leader to help them to be delivered from that situation. And again, the people rebelled. And from all the outward appearances, God's purpose for right living and glory in Israel, they were just failing. When the neighbours looked at them, they just didn't think they were very impressed at all. In the midst of all the difficulties and the depression, the book of Ruth gives us just a glimpse of the work of God in the lives of ordinary folk in the worst of times. And a fantastic illustration of God's work in the long term is found in chapter 4 and verse 22. I'll read it to you. And a bit of a spoiler alert, I'm sorry. But Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. The child that would eventually be born to Ruth and Boaz is a man called Obed, who became the father of Jesse, who fathered David. And he was the man who led Israel to her greatest heights in history. And let's not forget, from David's line came who? Our Lord Jesus Christ. Who would have thought, just at the very beginning of this book, that in a very short time, relatively speaking, the world was going to change for eternity? That's got to be up there on the wow factor, hasn't it? And this really is how significant our personal life stories are if Jesus is on the throne of our lives. We have no idea of the long-term effect of God's plan for our lives. We have no Scooby. It's only the other side of eternity we will see what God has achieved through our lives. And here is a great encouragement as we see God working for the best in the worst of times. On a personal family level and a national level too, we see the truth. And even when things are working against us and we think God is a long way off, he is there, continually laying foundations for our benefit, for our happiness, for our future. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it's not there. Because faith is what? Being sure of what we hope for and being certain of what we do not see. And Austin's now going to read for us some scripture to give us an encouragement.
You have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit, when I rise. You perceive my thoughts from afar. You discern my going out and my lying down. You are familiar with all my ways. Before a word is on my tongue, you, Lord, know it completely. You hem me in behind and before. You lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, too lofty for me to attain. Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there. If I rise on the wings of the dawn, if I settle on the far side of the sea, even there your hand will guide me. Your right hand will hold me fast. If I say, surely the darkness will hide me and the light become night around me, even the darkness is not dark to you. The night will shine like the day, for darkness is as light to you. For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful. I know that full well. My frame was not hidden from you when I was made in the secret place, when I was woven together in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed body. All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. How precious to me are your thoughts, God. How vast is the sum of them. Were I to count them, they would number the grains of the sand. When I awake, I am still with you.
This is the story of Ruth. So back in our text, verses 1 to 5 describe the misery of Naomi. In verse 1, there's a famine in Judah, and we heard that Naomi and her husband Elimelech and their sons Machlon and Chilion, they move. Life is tough for them. But I want us to put a context on that, because these folks know where the famine comes from. Because from Israel's position of faith, when the rains are being withheld, this is a punishment from God. And fully aware of the law, they knew that the nation was in disobedience. Now, I'm just going to read you a passage from Leviticus in chapter 26, where it says, "If you follow my decrees and are careful to obey my commands, I will send you rain in its season, and the ground will yield its crops, and the trees of the field their fruit. Your threshing will continue until grape harvest, and the grape harvest will continue until planting, and you will eat food, all that you want, and live in safety in your land." You see, for them, when the rains are withheld, it's a hand of judgment. And then, of course, for this family, there was this decision for them to move to Moab. But Moab is a pagan country with foreign gods. So with the move to Moab, along with this whole thing about judgment from God, they're playing with fire, despite the appeal of food and water and work. Now, historically, with Moab, there's been animosity between the two countries for many, many years. And it went right back in history until even more recently, in Judges chapter 3, we see that there was the assassination of King Eglon, the Moabite king, by a man called Ehud, who was the judge at the time. But even this did not deter this family to move. So let's have a look where it is. There we go. So Jerusalem on your left as you look at it, and Moab is on the right. Okay, the country of Moab, possibly the high fertile plateau to the south of the Arnon River. It's only about 60 miles away, so that's a bit stretched out to fit the screen. Okay, and this area enjoys rainfall that passes over the Judean desert. The Ephrathites, and you got that right, Charlotte, in verse 2, were folk named as such from the region around Bethlehem, and some have actually suggested that their customs and their language, because it was quite near, it's only 50, 60 miles, they thought the customs and language might have been similar. There's no actual proof of that, but I think that's a reasonable assumption. Now, despite all of this, the move really wasn't going to improve their lot all that much, because they were migrants, and life for migrants is never going to be easy. They could never buy or own their own land. They had to take employment for low wages and join the lowest level of the economy of Moab. And as well as all these facts, God had called his people to be separate from all these surrounding nations because he understood perfectly the human pull to the sensational and essential. And he's also aware of the damage that these things could produce in their lives. But the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. Do you know, I could hear my father's voice all week and it was driving me mad. That's it. Don't forget, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. And I never understood it until later in life. And I was thinking about that man who wanted to be like his neighbours and have a bigger and better house. And he was always trying to improve what he had. So in the end, he put his house on the market and he thought, I'll get a good price for this and I'll go and buy a bigger house. And so that's what he did. And the estate agent put it in some classified ads as well. And he was reading a classified ad one day that was house for sale. And he loved the description of it. So he phoned the guy up. He said, well, I really like the description of that house. Could you give me the details? He said, that's your house. Because sometimes we're just not happy with what we've got. The grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. And sadly to this family, that's what this was. Then in verse 3, Naomi's husband died. And she must have felt the judgment of God was following her, adding to her grief. And then, in a verse time, I mean, obviously, there's periods of time between this. Then the very next verse, her 2 sons take Moabite wives, Orpah and Ruth. This is a real problem because these are foreigners that are taken in. And we know that they weren't supposed to marry outside of their nation. So not only have they gone to live in a foreign nation with all its foreign gods, with all its temptations, and with all its slippery standards, and not be seen, of course, because they could just fit in like most of us do. You know, they've now taken on Moabite women. With that goes all the relations and all the other customs. You can see it all building, can't you? It's getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. There's more judgment to come. And then her sons die. Now what? In our society, we say these things come in 3s. She got 5 in a go. And then in verse 6, we see, when she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, Naomi and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. I don't know how you read that. There were no letters, I don't suppose, like we get today. There was certainly no internet. And she probably heard the gossip from a trader or something else. And for her, this will be survival, wouldn't it? She's on her own. These 3 women on their own. Women in any Eastern culture on their own were vulnerable. And they couldn't make a living, really. So for survival reasons, the decision is made to return to Judah. Her daughters-in-law go part way. And then we have this whole section in verses 8 through 13, where she tries to persuade them to return to their families. Now, there's 4 reasons, okay? So I'm just breaking it down to 4 reasons for you why the writer devotes so much space to Naomi's effort to deter Ruth and Orpah. So first of all, the scene emphasizes Naomi's misery. So for example, verse 11, return home, my daughters, why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? In other words, Naomi had nothing to offer. Her condition is worse than theirs as she sees it. If they try to be faithful to her name and the name of their husbands, they'll find nothing but pain. And so she concludes in verse 12, return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. And even if there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight, gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up and marry them? No, my daughters, it's bitter for me. More bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me. This is all about Naomi. Don't come with me, she says, because God is against me. If you come with me, your life could end up as bitter as mine. Secondly, it's to help us to understand a custom in Israel which is going to turn everything around for Naomi in the following chapters. And that custom, of course, was that when an Israelite husband had died, his brother or near relative was to marry the widow and continue the brother's name. And we see that in Deuteronomy chapter 25. I'm not going to read it to you, but it's in the notes if you want to read it later on. Now, she's referring to this custom in chapter 1 and verse 11 when she says she has no sons to marry Ruth or Orpah. The way that she sees things is that it's hopeless for Ruth and Orpah to remain committed to this family name. And at this point, Naomi has either forgotten or has chosen to forget that there may be another relative who might possibly perform the duty of a brother and take her daughter-in-laws as wives. And the third reason is that the girls are Moabites and the reception might be hostile. Just think about who she is. Just think of the stir when they left. Just think what it's going to be like when you're going back. You know, when you've done something wrong or you've moved away and you've got to go back? How hard is that? So why compound it? It's better when people feel sorry for you, isn't it? Than actually bringing back more trouble. Why are you bringing these foreigners back? Could Naomi be trying to avoid a confrontation, I wonder? It's a good question. We don't know. And I'm not being unkind, I promised I'm not, but I just think we've got to be realistic about who they were. Now there is a point here that is really worthy of note. Naomi, after all that she had been through, was going home. She and Elimelech had made a conscious decision to leave home and go to Moab. We've established that. And we've established that that was probably a wrong move. And now in humility, she had to admit her mistakes and carry her pain. Now that was very brave to do that. However, like us in similar circumstances, she exaggerated her hopelessness. And she became so bitter to the point where she couldn't even see the possibility that God was in control of all this. She was having a bit of a pity party, really. And this is a picture that is so current and real for the church today. Even when everything in us cries out to let God have control, still we hold on to the misery that we enjoy so much. All because it gives us attention and means that we don't have to be honest and vulnerable. But it was God who broke the famine and opened a way for her to go home. It was God who had preserved the relatives to continue the family line. It was God who constrained Ruth to stay with Naomi. But Naomi is so embittered by all of the circumstances of her disobedience that she suffers this kind of spiritual tunnel vision. How many times have we seen and done that? So determined to have things our way that we can justify anything, particularly, Christians are good at this, we can add a Bible verse to it. Wake up, Christian. God sees everything, so why try to kid a kidder? You know, I've read this great story of two monks, and they were traveling to help collect the harvest on a farm. And as they came past a river, this older lady was sitting by the river, and she was weeping, and they said, "What's wrong?" And she said, "The bridge has been washed away, I can't get across." And they said, "Don't worry about it." So they got hold of her, and they made a chair, and they, with their hands, and they walked her across the river and helped her on her way. And as they were continuing on to the farm to help with the harvest, the second monk said, "God, you know what? That woman, she was so heavy, wasn't she?" And the other one just smiled and they carried on. And he said, "Look at my clothes." And he carried on a little bit further on. He said, "You know, if we hadn't have helped that woman, I wouldn't be in pain." And he just ignored him, carried on. And eventually, the second one lay down on the ground. He said, "I can't go a bit further," he says. "My back is so sore. If we hadn't helped that stupid woman, why don't we just go and help with the harvest?" And the other one said, "Look, have you noticed I'm not complaining?" He said, "Because I put that woman down way back at the river. You're still carrying her. That's why you've got a bad back." And this is what many of us do when we're dealing with our issues and our pain. We're like that second monk. We just can't let go of it. We hold on to the pain of the past and we hold it over people's head like a club. Or we remind them every once in a while of the burden that we carry because of something we experienced years ago. But you see, perspective is all important if we are to see the purposes of God. You see, Naomi was so worried about herself, she could see no purpose at all. And the fourth reason, if it works, fourth one, is an emphasis on Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi. Verse 13, "Would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters, it's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has gone against me." At this they wept together. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. Nothing can persuade Ruth to leave her, even with Naomi's grim description of the future. And I think this is just a beautiful picture of real integrity. That despite the seeming hopelessness of widowhood, or maybe of childlessness, Ruth clung to Naomi, not wishing her to face the darkness on her own. That's grace. And the decision of these two women is symbolic as they separate from Naomi. Orpah kissed and Ruth clung. Now, Orpah's decision was a really hard one, but she went back to her people and to her gods. Now, what do we know about Orpah? Well, some commentators tell us that actually she was the progenitor, the ancestor of Goliath. So these families were going to meet again, weren't they? You see, our decisions always have consequences. You remember we talked about this many times about the rock in the pool. Remember the pool that you can see the images of the mountains in the pool, and then suddenly a big rock goes into it and it splash, and there's all these waves that go by, and that's exactly what our lives are like. See, our decisions always have consequences. Ruth, however, clung. And the Hebrew word for clung onto her speaks of the ideal closeness that can be experienced in a marriage relationship. So look at the comment. Look, verse 16. Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. And where you are buried, I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me." It sounds like marriage vows, doesn't it? She is so committed to this mother-in-law. And there's good reason why, and we'll come to that. And the more we read these words, the more encouraged we become at the grace that's being displayed. Ruth's commitment to a destitute mother-in-law means leaving her family and her homeland. It means possibly a future as a single woman, because Naomi has said that there's no man to take her. And if she married a non-relative, her commitment to that family would be lost. There's also going to a foreign land with different customs and language. And I know some people have said they were similar, but nothing is ever the same, is it? I mean, look at us and the Americans. I mean, we all speak a similar language, but their culture and our culture are totally different. Our politics are totally different. Everything is different. Our expressions are different. And it was a commitment that she was making even more radical than marriage. See, one cannot be impressed, but be impressed by Ruth's words, "Your God will be my God." Even though Naomi has already said in verse 13 that her experience of God is bitterness. And this is what I mean when we're going to talk about Naomi, because clearly this has not always been the way in this family. And I'm convinced that there's a backstory here that we don't see. And I'd love to be a fly on the wall and seen that story. How Naomi would have been with these girls who come from a Moabite tradition, how she shared their life and their religion with them, talked about the history of Israel and talked about the goodness of God, and how these girls have come to a realization of the presence of God in all this. How Orpah maybe didn't respond quite the same as Ruth did. But Ruth has clearly responded, and that's why they behaved in the way that they did. They weren't just doing themselves a favour, they were actually doing it because there was a sense of faithfulness there and a commitment. You know, I read a great illustration this week of some pastors who were talking together about the merits of various translations of the Bible. And one said, well, you know, I prefer the King James Version because it's simple and beautiful English. Another one liked the Revised Standard Version because he said he felt it was closer to the original Hebrew and Greek. Another one said, well, I like the more contemporary version because the vocabulary is so much more up to date. People can really understand it. And the last one just sat for a while and he said, you know, I like my mother's translation best. And they said, oh, we didn't know your mum was a Bible translator. He said, oh yeah, she translated it into real life and it was the most convincing translation I ever saw. We are the only Bible that some people ever read. And Ruth is one of these people, Sam mentioned that earlier, I'm glad you mentioned that, who translate and transpose integrity into real life. And we're left to wonder for ourselves what she knew of God at this point in her life. Maybe her family had told her the stories of Israel and the faithfulness of God. Well, I don't suppose we're ever going to know this side of eternity, but it's a lovely thought. So pilgrimage, our journey of faith, it sees beyond the bitter setbacks and it knows the freedom from the so-called securities that this world has to offer. Faith, it provides us the courage to venture into the unknown and sometimes into the strange in the knowledge that God is in control. And we're going to continue next week. Now, before we close in this part in prayer, I'm going to come round you and sing the next hymn, and I've got some homework for you.